Hi, my name is Justin Bursler. I'm the software development lead for the IBM MobileFirst Platform Foundation command line interface. And what I'd like to show you today is how to integrate the MobileFirst CLI into a Grunt workflow. So just as an overview, what we're going to do is first create a MobileFirst project, and then we'll install Grunt and start configuring Grunt tasks to do things that are helpful during MobileFirst hybrid application development. So let's get started. I've already got the MobileFirst CLI installed, so I'm going to go ahead and create a project using the mfp create command, and I'll name my project My Project. After it's created, I'll cd inside the project, and what I'm going to do to start off is to create a package.json file to describe my project. This isn't really necessary, although it does make saving your development dependencies a whole lot easier, so that when another developer checks your project out of source control, all they have to do is run npm install, and they'll get all of your development dependencies and will be able to run the build immediately. So here I've created a package.json file, and I'll just copy and paste in some pretty plain contents for package.json. Just got a name, a version, and description. I'll save that, and then go back to the command line. Now what I'm going to do here is install Grunt and the Grunt CLI so that I can start running Grunt builds. But it's important to note that when I run the npm install command, I'm going to use the save dev flag. And what that will do is put all of the dependencies that I need into my package.json file under the save dependencies field. So I'll just go ahead and do that. I'll do npm install Grunt and Grunt CLI using the save dev flag. And once that's done, I'll go back to my package.json file and verify that the dev dependencies field did get updated. And sure enough, there is Grunt and Grunt CLI. Now what I'm going to do is create a Grunt file for Grunt to use. This will help us to configure Grunt to run the tasks that we want it to run. And again, I'll just copy and paste in some pretty plain contents here, and we'll get to work configuring it in a moment. For now, let's save this Grunt file and run Grunt from the command line just to verify that we've got everything installed. Of course, it's not going to do anything because we haven't specified any tasks yet. Great. What do we want our Grunt build to do? Well, if we're developing hybrid mobile applications, that is, mobile applications that are implemented using web technologies, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, it'd be really nice to have our JavaScript validated by JS hint. So Grunt provides a plugin for linting your JavaScript files. It's called Grunt contrib JS hint. And I'll go ahead and install that with npm, again using the save dev flag. And once that's done, I'll go back to my package.json file and verify one last time that it is indeed updating my dev dependencies field. And there it is right there. So now that we've got Grunt contrib JS hint installed, let's configure a Grunt file to use it. The first thing that we need to do is run load npm tasks from the Grunt object. And this takes the name of the tasks that we want to load. In this case, it's Grunt contrib JS hint. After that, we need to specify the options to JS hint that we want to run. This includes the files that we want to lint, as well as any options that we want to pass into JS hint directly. So to do that, we go up to the Grunt initconfig function call, and inside the configuration object, we'll specify a JS hint property. And this allows us to configure the JS hint task. Inside that, I'm going to go ahead and create a subtask called JS. And this will be for linting just my JavaScript files. So in the options for this subtask, I'll tell it to lint my JavaScript files as well as a number of options that I want to pass into JS hint. So I use the source attribute to specify the files that I want to lint. And in this case, I'm going to pick all of the JS files under my apps folder and all of the JS files under my adapters folder, as this is typically where most of my JavaScript is going to live in my hybrid mobile application. Next, I'll pass in a set of options to JS hint, and I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste some options that I found that work well for hybrid mobile applications. And the last thing to note here is a couple things. One, JavaScript is actually a very difficult language to statically analyze, and that's exactly what JSHint is trying to do. It's trying to read through your JavaScript files and figure out what's going on and provide you hints, really, about what might be going wrong or how you could do things better. But it's important to notice that these are really just suggestions. And so with that in mind, I don't really want any JSHint warnings or failures of any kind to stop the rest of my build. And in order to facilitate that, what I'll do is create this options object under the JSHint task, and I'll specify a force attribute of true. And that does exactly what I described. It will make sure that even if the JSHint task fails, the rest of my build will continue anyway. Obviously, this is something that you don't need to do, or that you can change at some point in the future, should you find that the JSHint options you specify really do represent what you would consider breaks in your application. So let's go back to the terminal and give this a try. We can do this by running grunt JSHint, and that should run our JSHint task. It did in fact run, but we get this nice message from JSHint saying that 0 files were linted, and that maybe we should check our files list. The reason for this is that our project doesn't yet have any JavaScript files. So what I'll do is I'll use the MobileFirst CLI to create a new hybrid application. And to do that, I run mfp add hybrid. I'll specify a name of my new app, and I get a message telling me that the application was successfully created. Now if I run JSHint again, we should see 3 files were found and are in fact lint-free. Great. Let's enhance this a little bit more, and we'll add a subtask for linting our HTML files, as our HTML files tend to have JavaScript in them, and we might as well lint that as well. The important thing to note when trying to lint your HTML files is that we have to pass in an option to JSHint to let it know that what we're giving it is HTML files, and it needs to find the JavaScript inside. And that option is extract, and it must be set to always. And for the HTML subtask, I'll specify all of the HTML files under my apps folder. So let's go back to the terminal, and this time let's just run the HTML subtask. We do that by running grunt JSHint :HTML, and that will only lint our HTML files. And sure enough, 1 file was found, and it is lint-free. We could, of course, run the grunt JSHint task entirely, in which case Grunt will just iterate over all of our subtasks, and in this case, lint our JavaScript and HTML files. So now that we have a good sense that this is working, let's really verify it by going and introducing some bad JavaScript into our files and making sure that JSHint catches it. So first, I'll go into my hybrid app, and I'll find the main JavaScript file, and I'll introduce some substandard JavaScript in here. In this case, I'll put a line of code in that's missing the semicolon at the end. And we'll make sure that JSHint is able to find this. I'll save the file, go back and run grunt JSHint, and sure enough, it finds the file and tells me that it's missing a semicolon. Let's go back and fix that error and verify that linting our HTML files works as well. So I'll go to the index.html file in my app, and I'll introduce what could only be described as blatantly invalid JavaScript. This time I do remember to put the semicolon at the end, but I don't think that's going to fool JSHint. Save the file, run grunt JSHint again, and sure enough, it finds and points out my problems. Let's fix this error, save again. So now that we're fairly confident that JSHint is linting our JavaScript files, let's go back to the grunt file and create a default task. And what this will do is basically allow us to run simply grunt from the command line without specifying any subtasks, and it will run the tasks that we've specified here as default. To do that, we use grunt.registerTask. For the first argument, we pass in a name of default, and this is a special name that is recognized by Grunt. And then the second argument is an array of tasks to run when we run Grunt from the command line. In this case, just JSHint. So we'll save the Grunt file, go back to the command line, and this time only run Grunt and verify that it runs our default task. Great. So now that we are fairly confident that JSHint is doing what it ought to be doing, let's think about how this works. If we're in the middle of active development, we go to our editor, we make a bunch of changes, and we save them. We still have to go back to the command line and run either Grunt or Grunt JSHint to make sure that everything is still in line. Wouldn't it be better if this happened for us automatically whenever our files changed? If there was some way for us to tell Grunt to automatically run all of our tasks that we want to run every time our files change. To do this, Grunt provides a plugin called Grunt Contrib Watch. And we'll go ahead and install that using npm install, again with the save dev flag so that our package.json gets updated. And the way that the watch plugin works is that you specify a certain set of files that you want it to watch. And whenever those files change, it will kick off the tasks that you specify to run when those files have changed. So let's go back to our Grunt file and we'll load the npm task as before, this time passing in grunt contrib watch. And then we can start to configure it in the init-config object by specifying a watch task. And just like with JSHint, I'm going to start off by creating separate subtasks. The first one will be to watch my apps, right, which is the hybrid apps under my apps folder. So I'll call that subtask apps, and I'll configure it to watch all of the files under the apps folder. And I do that with two wildcard matches. The first one matches the files immediately under the apps folder, and the second one matches all of the files and folders even further in the subtree. And secondly, I'll specify that the tasks that I want it to run, in this case, it's just JSHint. It's the only task we have at the moment. Great, so let's save the Grunt file, go back to the command line, and verify that our watch task is in fact working. To do that, I just run grunt watch. And you'll notice this time that when I run the watch task, Grunt doesn't immediately return the command line prompt. Instead, it's sitting here waiting for my files to change. So let's go change a file that we've told it to watch and see what happens. In this case, I'll go back to the index.html file, and I won't change any JavaScript. I'll just change this message in HTML. And you'll notice, as soon as I save my file, the watch task kicks off the JSHint task. The other thing to note is that even still, the watch task has not returned the command prompt. It's going to continue watching these files and waiting and running tasks until I come in here and break the process. So let's verify that by going back to the index.html file, and we'll introduce a JavaScript error, again by removing the semicolon, and save the file, and we'll notice that JSHint does run, and it does find our error, which is super handy. We'll put the semicolon back, and save, and verify that our files are again lint-free. Now that we're comfortable that that's working, let's go back to the Grunt file and specify a second watch subtask to watch our adapter files. Create a new subtask, I'll call it adapters, and I'll specify that I want it to watch the files under my adapters folder, pretty much exactly the same way that I did with my apps folder. And again, I'll tell it that I want to run the JSHint task. And you may look at this and say to yourself, well, these two subtasks are almost identical. Why have two separate subtasks if they're just going to run the same task? And that's a really good point. I could have taken the new file matches and put it into the existing subtask, but this is getting stubbed out for later when I want to do different things when my apps change versus my adapters change. So we'll just leave it like this for now. So let's go back to the terminal and verify that the watch task is appropriately watching my adapters folder. I'll run the grunt watch task again. And at this point, I don't have any adapters in my project. So I'll bring up a new terminal window, cd into my project, and use the mfp add adapter command to create a new adapter. I call my new adapter first adapter. I'll choose HTTP as the type and select the rest of the defaults. And sure enough, watch notices the files that were created and runs the JS hint task. Let's go to a JavaScript file in my new adapter, and I'll introduce some substandard JavaScript and make sure that JS hint catches it. Here I'll just add an extraneous equal sign. Save the file, JS hint runs, it finds the problem. I can go back to my file and fix it, and save, and verify my files are again lint-free. So that's great and really handy. We are linting our JavaScript files automatically as we develop. We're getting instant feedback about when we're doing things that may be wrong or maybe even just a little substandard. But at this point, if we wanted to test our application, we'd still have to go to the command line and run the mfp build and mfp deploy commands in order to go verify that our changes are actually working. It'd be great if we could somehow integrate that into our Grunt process as well. And of course we can. In order to do that though, we first need a function in our Grunt file which is capable of running arbitrary commands on the command line. So I'll go back to the Grunt file. And I'll just create a new function in here that's able to run arbitrary commands on the command line. And I won't go into great big detail about how this works. It's very generic Node code for running commands. The important thing to keep in mind about this function is that it takes 3 arguments. A name, which is the label that we want to use for the command that we're running, the actual command itself that we want to run, and a JavaScript object to specify options to the command itself. In this case, we're really interested about passing in a current working directory so that when we run the MFP commands, we can specify which folder to run them under. So big picture is that we want to be able to use this function to run, for example, MFP build under the apps folder to just tell it to build our apps, or MFP build under the adapters folder just to make it build the adapters. And hopefully this will make it a little bit faster. The last thing to note about this function is that no matter what happens, it always spits the standard output of the command to the console so that we can verify that things happened correctly. So now that we've got this function that's able to run arbitrary commands on the command line, we need to make a Grunt task that's able to use it to run our MobileFirst CLI. And before I start implementing that, I just want to stub it out so that we can see what this new Grunt task will look like. I want to call it MobileFirst, and I want it to have subtasks of build and deploy. And I also want to be able to pass it in an argument telling it what it ought to build or deploy. And so just to start, this is what it should look like. MobileFirst build apps if I wanted to run the task to build my apps. And I'll just add that to my default task just as a way to stub it out. Additionally, I'd also like to be able to separately build my adapters. So I'll specify MobileFirst build adapters. Now, for some Grunt terminology, the first part of the task, MobileFirst, that will be referred to as the name. The second or subtask is referred to as the target, and the third part is referred to as an argument, which will be passed into the task function, which we'll see in a second. So let's implement this new Grunt task. To do that, we use Grunt register multitask. And we use multitask because we know that the MobileFirst task is going to have subtasks of build and deploy. I'll specify MobileFirst as the name, and the second argument is the function that actually implements the task. And that argument will actually get a parameter, which is the third segment of the task. In this case, it'll be apps or adapters. So we'll stub out the rest of the syntax and start implementing this function. Now, to do this, I'm going to use the exec command function that we implemented just prior. But if you'll notice in the exec command function, we use this. And I want to make sure that this is the this that I want it to be when it runs. And so rather than invoking the function directly, I'm going to use the apply function to make sure that the this is the this I need it to be, which in this case is this. The second argument to apply is the arguments that we want to pass into the exec command function. Passed in as an array. The first one, if you'll remember, is the label to use for the command. In this case, I'll just call it MobileFirst task. The second argument is the command itself that we want to run. And in this case, we want to run mfp either build or deploy. And if you remember, the second part of our grunt task gets passed in as the target, which we have access to right here with this .target. So if we run MobileFirst build, this .target will be build. If we run MobileFirst deploy, this .target will be deploy, running the correct command. And then the third argument is a JSON object, which we'll use to specify the current working directory for the command. And to do that, we just specify the CWD property. And remember that the third part of our grunt task, either apps or adapters, gets passed in as the artifact folder parameter. The last thing that we need to do is to go back to our initconfig object and stub out the MobileFirst task and subtasks. Grunt simply needs these to be stubbed out so that it knows they exist when we go to run from the command line. So we'll save the grunt file, go back to the terminal, and give our new task a try by running grunt MobileFirst build apps. And we can verify that this works properly because in the end, it will spit out the standard out for the mfp build command. And in this case, it says all apps were successfully built. And that gives us a clue that indeed the mfp build command ran, and it ran under the apps folder. Now let's try again running grunt MobileFirst build adapters. And in the same way, we can verify that our build was run under the adapters folder by checking the console output. All adapters were successfully built. So now that we have a good idea that our new MobileFirst grunt task is working, wouldn't it be great if we had this run as part of our watch task? That is, every time our apps files change, we automatically build the apps. Or every time one of our adapters files changes, we automatically build the adapters. And at this point, it's very easy. All we have to do is specify additional tasks that we want to run in the tasks object of our watch subtasks. So in this case, when our apps change, we want to run MobileFirst build apps. And then when our adapters change, we want to run MobileFirst build adapters. So we'll save the grunt file, go back to the terminal, and verify that our watch task is now building our apps and adapters when they change. First, I'll go back to my index.html file, and I'll change the message again and save. And verify this time that not only does our JS hint task run, but our MobileFirst build apps runs successfully, saying all apps were successfully built. But building our apps is not enough to test them. We need to deploy them. But since we've parameterized our MobileFirst grunt task, we already have everything that we need. All we need to do is specify a MobileFirst deploy apps and a MobileFirst deploy adapters task to run when our files change. So let's just go ahead and do that. Here we're saying every time one of our apps files changes, run the build apps and deploy apps task. And secondly, when any of our adapters files changes, run the build adapters task and the deploy adapters task. So far we haven't used the deploy task, so let's go ahead and manually verify that it is in fact working. So first, I'll manually run grunt MobileFirst build apps again, and then I'll run grunt MobileFirst deploy apps to make sure that that's working. Unfortunately, we get an error here, but it's a pretty easy one to fix. If you remember, when we created our build subtask, we had to stub it out in the grunt initconfig object, and it's the same thing for our deploy task. So we just need to go back to the grunt file and stub out the deploy subtask so that grunt recognizes it. Now we can go back to the terminal and verify that our deploy apps task is working. To do that, we'll bring up the MobileFirst console by running mfp console. It'll bring up a browser, and sure enough, we can see that my new app is deployed, and when I preview it, it's got the content that I expect. So now let's put it all together. Let's run our watch task, change some files, and verify that not only are our files lint-free, but they get built and deployed automatically for us. And first I'll go back to my editor and change my index.html file. I'll change the message again. And now when I save, you'll notice that the watch task kicks off, lints all my files, and then runs build apps because we changed an app file, and then subsequently deploy apps. And just like that, within a few seconds, I can go back to my console, refresh the browser, and immediately see my change. Let's try it out for adapters. And in this case, I'm going to create a new adapter as a sort of race against the watch task. I'll create a new adapter, and then as fast as I can, I'll try to test this new adapter by using the invoke command on the MobileFirst CLI. I'll call my new adapter stories. I'll pick the defaults beyond that point. And as soon as the command line returns, I'll immediately start typing out the mfp invoke command to test it. And notice that all the while the JS hint is already run, the build has already finished, and we're now deploying. And before I can even finish typing the invoke command, my adapter is deployed and ready for testing. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how you can integrate the MobileFirst CLI into your Grunt workflow. There are plenty of other options to be explored and lots of Grunt plugins that you can use to enhance this. But hopefully this will start you down the path of a better development experience. Thanks for watching.